Sometimes in your search for happiness, you ponder the meaning of your life.
And what is the truth?
You sift your memory for beginnings.
The truth.
You send your mind ahead for directions.
Truth.
But all you really know is now, and you are lost in the present.
And what is the truth?
Well, now, here's a man who wants to get right down to it. Kind of anxious to get to it, are you? Whatever.
Welcome back to the History of Being Human podcast. I'm the host, Noel Armstrong. Contact me at thobhpodcast@gmail.com. thobhpodcast@gmail.com. We are still trying to resurrect sense and meaning from the dust of a billion factoids. This is the second episode in our seminal, our world historic series on the mysterious deaths of historical figures. We started last time with the death of King Tut. As I was preparing that episode, I realized that there was a mystery within that mystery. Well, let's face it, there were many mysteries within that mystery. But the one that is relevant to today's program, there was another mysterious death in King Tut's own family, specifically the woman identified as the mother of King Tut. I said in that episode that the mother of King Tut had been identified, or at least one desiccated mass of decomposing carbon-based products and nucleic acids had been identified as the earthly remains of King Tut's mother, and that aside from DNA analysis, pegging her as the mother of King Tut, we don't know much about her. We don't know who this was. But more to the point of today's episode, we don't know how she died. Researchers say that she was no more than 35 years old. That's the maximum upper limit of how old she was when she died. And yet there are evidences on her person of possible foul play and at least a very violent injury, possibly causing her death. And so today, on the second episode of the mysterious deaths of historical figures, we're going to kind of continue along the same lines of the last episode and talk about the mysterious death of the mother of King Tut.
Start at the beginning.
Yeah. And when you come to the end, stop.
On the west bank of the Nile River, across from the modern city of Luxor, lies the Valley of the Kings, in the heart of the Theban necropolis, as it's known. For over 500 years, the very wealthy rulers of the New Kingdom 18th, 19th, and 20th dynasties buried their dead there. Now, the name Valley of the Kings is a little bit of a misnomer. Not only would the kings be buried in that valley, but also some of their family members, and even some very high-ranking priests and royal officials. The Valley of the Kings is not very scenic. It's a desolate, dry riverbed. But that's intentional. In fact, everything about the location of the Valley of the Kings was intentional. It's specifically on the west side of the Nile. Because the sun went down in the west, the Egyptians believed that the sun god went to the west to die, and there to be rejuvenated and reborn in the east the following day. So if you wanted to be buried where the sun god died and was buried each day, if you wanted that hope for a glorious rejuvenation and rebirth, then you were buried in the west. That was traditional funerary practice for Egyptian royalty. And frankly, in fact, very few Egyptian cemeteries were on the eastern side of the Nile. Most cemeteries were on the west side of the Nile, just like the Valley of the Kings. Now, not to confuse you, but the Valley of the Kings is actually two valleys. It's a wadi, but it consists of two valleys. A wadi, of course, is a dry riverbed. It consists of an eastern and western valley. The eastern valley of the Valley of the Kings is the one that was used the most. It's the one that has by far the most tombs. Another reason that the New Kingdom pharaohs might have chosen the Valley of the Kings to be buried in is because the entire area is towered over by the highest Theban peak, which is called the Horn. Now, why it's called the Horn, I don't know, because it really looks like a pyramid. It's shaped like a pyramid. This would be considered sacred topography to the ancient Egyptians. By that time, the pyramid had already been associated with burial and rebirth for thousands of years. And the presence of a natural pyramid, not one that had been built with human hands, but one seemingly built by the gods, was seen as evidence of divine presence in the valley, or looking over the valley. In fact, to the ancient Egyptians, the entire area with the peak looking over it was considered sacred to the goddess known as the Mistress of the West. That was Hathor. So this was a sacred valley to the goddess Hathor. You might wonder why a pharaoh would choose to be buried in such a desolate, isolated wasteland. But that very desolation, that very lifelessness, is a huge part of what endeared that valley to the priests and pharaohs as a burial place. In fact, one of the earliest burials in the Valley of the Kings was the pharaoh Thutmose I. His high priest Eneni is the one who recommended that he be buried in this valley. And on the walls of the tomb of Eneni, which has also been found in the same valley, Eneni talks about the rationale for choosing this location. He says, quote, "I saw the excavation of the rock tomb of His Majesty. I was alone, no one seeing, no one hearing." So these were secret burials. That was the only way to protect them or prevent them from being raided and stolen from. Remember, this is New Kingdom Egypt. Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom Egypt had their own tombs, and the New Kingdom pharaohs and priests were well aware of the fact that many of these tombs had been raided and stolen from. So they opted for these desolate, out-of-the-way, hidden tombs in the Valley of the Kings. And it's certainly not because they wanted to be humble. Pharaohs built what's called mortuary temples, where they provided a gaudy, ostentatious display and recounting of their heroic deeds and their fabulous wealth and so forth. But their remains, the part of them that they wanted to live on in the afterlife, could not be desecrated. It had to be protected by loyal priests, hidden out of the way of robbers. So the Valley of the Kings checked all the boxes. It was on the west side of the Nile, it was under that natural pyramid peak, and it was out of the way, it was isolated. So easy to hide and protect royal burial sites. Because of its ideal situation, for over 500 years, pharaohs of those 18th through 20th dynasties were buried in the Valley of the Kings. So far, archaeologists have dug up over 63 burial sites, and there are 20 more that were underway that were not finished. So since the late 1700s, since Egyptology was in its infancy, this area has been a focus of intense research. And it's really the gift that keeps on giving for hundreds of years now. In fact, the last discovery of 2 new entrances to tombs was in 2008. So from the 1700s to 2008, new discoveries are still being made. When a tomb is discovered, it's named KV and then a number. So KV meaning Valley of the Kings, Kings Valley, and then a number. And not all of these tombs are created equally. In fact, they're vastly different. They range in size from KV 54, which is little more than a simple pit, to KV 5. KV 5 is a complex tomb. It has over 120 chambers. That's the famous tomb for the sons of Ramses the Great. We referred to it in an earlier episode during the Bronze Age collapse. KV 5 really is a story in itself. But when we say that there are 63 tombs in the Valley of the Kings, you don't really get a sense for how vast and how complex the burial sites in this valley are. Well, the particular tomb we're going to be talking about in today's episode, if you looked at the title you already know, is KV 35. KV 35 is a tomb that was originally entered in 1898 by the French archaeologist Victor Loret. Now, I'm just going to strongly recommend that you go to the video that I have linked in the show notes. It's a fantastic animation put together by Robin Morgan, who I don't know who Robin Morgan is, but she put together a great animation about the layout and contents of KV 35. And if the music in that video drives you nuts, just realize you can turn the sound completely down because there's no over-narration. It's all just written out for you, and you can virtually tour KV 35. And you can see a couple of key points. First, this is the tomb of Amenhotep II, who died right around 1400 BC. Amenhotep II was a very powerful, wealthy, New Kingdom pharaoh who would have been the great-great-grandfather of King Tutankhamun, King Tut. Amenhotep II gave birth to Thutmose IV, who gave birth to Amenhotep III, who was the father, with his royal wife Tia, of Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh, who was the father of King Tut. When Loret discovered this, the original sarcophagus for Amenhotep II was still in its place in the main room, but there were several side chambers. Some of these side chambers were empty, and it's unknown what was in them. But there were 2 of the side chambers that had additional mummies in them. The main side chamber, the largest of the side chambers, had several royal mummies, and archaeologists could tell who they were almost immediately because of the inscriptions on their burial wrappings. So one of the mummies was Tutmos IV. Amenhotep III was there. Merneptah was there. Seti II, Siptah, Ramses 4, 5, and 6, all of them in a small chamber off to the side of the tomb KV35, which was Amenhotep II's tomb. It became apparent that this is where priests had stashed royal mummies for fear that they would be robbed. The priests probably thought that KV35 offered the best protection against tomb robbers. And so KV35 was not only the tomb for Amenhotep II, it was a cache for other royal mummies who were hiding from tomb robbers. In the Egyptian religion, tomb robbers were an existential threat to the afterlife of the various pharaohs. The reason that they went to such lengths to preserve the remains in a recognizable and identifiable state is because that's what your afterlife depended on. Your mummy had to remain recognizable, identifiable. When tomb robbers would enter these tombs, they would often burn the mummies, burn away the linen and all the organic material, looking for gold or jewels between the layers of the mummies. So the priests went to great lengths to try to protect these royal mummies. Around the 9th century BCE, they could no longer protect all of the various kings in their tombs. It looks like that's about the time that they took these other royal mummies and moved them into the tomb of Amenhotep II, and that's probably when it became a royal cache for all of those important mummies. So you have the main chamber where Amenhotep II and his sarcophagus were. Then you have these side chambers, one of which contains several very important royal mummies. There was another side chamber that contained 3 very mysterious mummies. These 3 mummies were found totally naked. No wrappings, no coffins, no identification whatsoever. Loray did not know at the time, and we still don't know to this very day, why these mummies were treated so differently than the other mummies in the tomb. Loray determined that there was an older woman among these 3 mummies, then a young boy who died around the age of 10, and then what he described as a young man because its head was shaven. Well, it turned out that that mummy with its head shaven was not a young man after all. That mummy turned out to be a young lady, and that is now the mummy known as KV35YL, young lady from Valley of the Kings Tomb 35. A few years after Loray originally discovered the mummies, an Egyptologist named Grafton Elliott Smith carefully examined the mummies and made some detailed observations. In fact, it was Grafton Elliott Smith who first identified KV35YL as a YL instead of a YM. He's the one who said, yeah, don't let the shaved head fool you. This is a younger lady. There's an older lady, a male child of about 10, and a younger lady. According to Grafton Elliott Smith, she was important. She was mummified in the manner traditionally reserved for royalty. But there were no glyphs, no markings, no way for him to tell exactly who this had been. Her height was 5 feet 2 inches tall. She had been very slight of build. He judged her to have been no more than 25 years old, based on the development of her iliac crest, and the fact that her wisdom teeth had not yet erupted. And I will just say that subsequent CT analysis proved that she could have been anywhere between 25 and 35 years old. So she was indeed a younger lady at the time of her death. He also made notes of areas of damage to the mummy. If you look at her torso, you can see that there's major damage to the front of the chest wall, possibly when tomb robbers were trying to remove a necklace or some other decoration from the mummy. The heart is left in place, the diaphragm is left in place, but there are 2 holes in the diaphragm where the lungs were removed. And that has nothing to do with foul play or tomb robbers. That's typical for mummies of this time. The lungs could be removed through holes in the diaphragm. In her left inguinal region, there's another hole, about 2 by 5 inches. That's where most of her internal organs would have been removed during the embalming process. So her internal organs were removed, and the cavities they left were filled with linen packs treated with resin to maintain the shape of the abdomen. The same thing can be said for the floor of the perineum. There's a hole in the floor of the perineum where, again, probably organs were removed. This does not appear to be due to any type of trauma or injury. There are small pelvic fractures that are thought to be post-mortem. The front half of both of her feet are missing, and again this is thought to be post-mortem damage. And that has to do with the fact that there's no evidence of healing, and the way the resin is broken off with the front halves of the feet means that the entire foot was resined, and then half of it broken off after death. And so the take-home there is, all of the damage to the torso and the lower extremities of the mummy are thought to have been due to the actions of grave robbers, or the embalming process, or just physically moving the mummy. All of it occurred after death. Now let's talk about the arms. The left arm is extended straight out along the side of her body. The right arm has been snapped off at the shoulder. When researchers first found this mummy, The right arm was not anywhere near where it was supposed to be. But this was also clearly after death. There's no evidence of healing, no evidence of trauma sustained during life. The right arm was snapped off at some time when the mummy was being moved. This whole snapped off right arm thing gave rise to some controversy in its own right. Researchers found 2 different right arms in KV-35. One of them they thought must belong to younger lady who was missing her right arm. One of those arms was straight and the other was bent at the elbow. Now, if the arm bent at the elbow belonged to the younger lady, that would be evidence that she was royalty, because royal mummies were often laid out with one arm straight and the other bent as if holding a scepter of power. So if the bent right arm belonged to the younger lady, that might be evidence that this was a queen. Researchers compared the 2 right arms to the remains of the younger lady, and what they found was the right arm with the bend did not match the body habitus, the physique of the younger lady. It was too big when compared to her left hand. The right arm that was straight, turns out, belonged to the younger lady. Now that doesn't prove she's not royalty. There are examples of royal mummies without the bent right arm, so absence of royal evidence is not evidence of royal absence. But it would have been nice if they could prove she was royalty by matching the bent right arm to her left arm, but they couldn't. So we don't know whether younger lady was royalty or not, based on her arm position. Moving now to the skull. There is a hole in the front of the cranium of the younger lady. The hole measures about 3.8 by 3 centimeters, so 1.5 inches by 1.2 inches. Bone fragments are found inside the skull, so this hole was punched from the outside into the skull, as you might expect. Within the skull, the brain and dura mater are still in place. Now that's kind of unusual. Typically, the brain would be extracted during the mummification process, and younger lady's brain and its meninges remained in place. But careful examination of the hole in the front of the skull, the way that the edges are beveled, the way that there are skull fragments inside the skull, the absence of healing, and some other factors conclusively proved to researchers that this was not an injury she sustained when she was still alive. This is post-mortem. One more interesting but not definitive factor. The younger lady had a double-pierced left earlobe. Now, her right earlobe was damaged. You can't tell anything from that. But pierced ears, double pierced ears, were actually fairly common during New Kingdom Egypt. This doesn't prove she was royal. While it might prove she could afford jewelry, that's all it proves. And with that, we now come to the most striking, the most immediately noticeable, and maybe the most devastating of the mummy's defects, and that is the mouth and face. If you look at a picture of younger lady, you'll see a gaping wound on the left side of her mouth and cheek. Some of the jawbone and teeth are even missing from this wound. That's how large it is. Now, initially, researchers thought this was also from the actions of tomb robbers, and that remained the opinion of Egyptologists for over 100 years. But in 2003, a team from the University of York, led by Jennifer Fletcher, carefully evaluated the mummy's remains with CT scanning, and what they found completely changed the story around KV-35YL, the younger lady. This wound, this terrifying gaping wound, occurred while the younger lady was still alive, and it's devastating enough that it is probably what caused her death. It's hard to imagine somebody living through this kind of trauma, because her jawbone, her facial bones, alveolar process, maxillary sinus, all of it is just crushed. And the facial bones are missing. Whoever embalmed her cleaned them away before she was embalmed. And more evidence of that is provided by the fact that whoever embalmed younger lady filled in that void, filled in that defect while they were embalming her with linen packs that were used to fill the defect at the site. So the fact that there was this massive wound, and that there's no evidence that it had any time to heal, and that the wound occurred before younger lady died, is very strong evidence. I would say nearly conclusive evidence that this is the trauma that killed younger lady, KV-35YL. And so, of course, the question becomes, the mystery becomes, what could have done this? What could have caved in literally half of her face? Was it accidental? Was it intentional? That's a mystery I want to come back to. But let's go to the other big mystery, just as great a mystery around KV-35YL, the younger lady. That is, who was this? Maybe knowing who she was will help us understand what happened to her. Spoiler alert, it really won't. But let's find out who she was anyway. There is no shortage of theories about who younger lady was. Originally, George Eliot Smith believed that she had lived during the time of Amenhotep II, whose tomb she was found in. But remember, there are mummies in that tomb from decades and even centuries away from the time of Amenhotep II. So just because she's in his tomb doesn't prove she lived around the time of of Amenhotep II. In fact, remember, Amenhotep II is the great-great-grandfather of King Tut, so she couldn't have been from his time, as we'll find out later. In 1999, Mary Ann Luban proposed that the younger lady was none other than Queen Nefertiti herself. That is a theory that she based on measurements between the mummy and the statue of Nefertiti, which were very close. Along with that, Queen Nefertiti is known to have worn a wig, which means she would have shaved her head. This mummy had a shaved head, and a wig was found somewhere in the tomb around the same area as younger lady. That and the fact that Queen Nefertiti's mummy has never been found, a queen of that importance, and they've never found her mummy. That's why Mary Ann Luban proposed younger lady of KV-35 was none other than Queen Nefertiti. This case was compelling enough that in 2003, Joanne Fletcher did her own independent research and again came to the same conclusion. This mummy was most likely Nefertiti. Now, I bring that up not because that's the only proposed solution to who younger lady was. There were many ideas about who this might be. But I bring it up because it's the most relevant to today's episode. If you listen to my previous episode on the death of King Tut, you already know whose mother younger lady was. Younger lady has been shown to be the mother of King Tut. You also know whose sister she was and whose wife she was when she bore King Tut, because I said that King Tut's parents were full brother and sister. She was the sister of Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh, and that means she has the same parents as Akhenaten. That would be Amenhotep III and his great royal wife, Tia. So younger lady is the daughter of Tia and Amenhotep III. With that information, then, it should be possible to narrow it down to just a few names of who younger lady could actually be, because the DNA results have ruled out Nefertiti. Now, why is Nefertiti ruled out? Because Nefertiti was not a full sister to Akhenaten. She's never listed as the king's sister. So she couldn't be King Tut's mother because King Tut's mother was a full sister to Akhenaten. Younger lady also could not be Kia. Kia was another wife of Akhenaten, but she also was never referred to as the king's sister or as Amenhotep III's daughter. So it couldn't be Kia, and it couldn't be Nefertiti just based on those formal titles that they were never given. If Nefertiti or Kia had indeed been the daughters of Amenhotep III, they would have carried that honorary title with them throughout their entire lives. That's just the way it was done. Neither of them were ever called the king's daughter, so KV-35YL, younger lady, being the king's daughter, could not have been Nefertiti or Kia. So who could younger lady have been? Let's go back to what we know. And I apologize because these very complicated family relationships are tough to parse out. We know that younger lady was the full sister of Akhenaten. That means she's the daughter of Amenhotep III and his great royal wife, Tia. We know she wasn't Nefertiti or Kia because they weren't the daughters of Amenhotep III. So that begs an important question. Who were the daughters of Amenhotep III? Because younger lady has to be one of those. Lucky for us, the royal Egyptians kept very detailed family records. It was critical that they did. Amenhotep III and his great royal wife Tia had 5 daughters, 5 known daughters. It has to be one of those 5 daughters. The 3 oldest daughters of Amenhotep III we can rule out as the mothers of King Tut. The reason for that is Amenhotep III married his 3 oldest daughters. They were the king's wives. If they had married Akhenaten, their brother, later in life, after Amenhotep III had died, they would have been Akhenaten's great royal wives. We know that Nefertiti was Akhenaten's great royal wife. So what that tells us is that Akhenaten never married his 3 oldest sisters. They could not be the mother of King Tut, and therefore they can't be KV-35YL, the younger lady. The 3 oldest daughters of Amenhotep III were named Sitamun, Isis, and Henuteneb. They are not the mother of King Tut. They are not KV-35YL. That leaves the 2 other known daughters of Amenhotep III and Tia. The youngest 2 daughters of those 2 never did marry their father. Their names were Bekhetaten and Nebeta. Not in that order. In fact, Nebeta was older than Bekhetaten. So KV-35YL most likely has to be either Nebeta or Bekhetaten. Because they had never married their father, Amenhotep III, they would not have had the title of Great Royal Wife had Akhenaten, their brother, married them. The DNA evidence is strong. The younger lady is the mother of King Tut, the sister of Akhenaten, the daughter of Amenhotep III, the only two known figures in all of ancient history who would fit the DNA evidence and all of the social conventions around the mother of King Tut would be Nebeta and Bekhetaten. One of those two is most likely the younger lady, KV35YL. Now, I say most likely because it's still not a sure thing. Amenhotep III could have had a daughter that we don't know about, but it's unlikely that he would have had a daughter with his great royal wife that wasn't documented. It's also possible that Nefertiti could still be KV35YL. I've seen arguments to that effect. Remember, before Akhenaten became Akhenaten, he was Amenhotep IV. He gave up that name and changed his name to Akhenaten. It's possible that Nefertiti changed her name and titles and indeed was the mother of King Tut. So we don't know. There are some variables out there still that make identification impossible. It's just that the most likely scenario is that it's one of the two youngest daughters of Amenhotep III, married Akhenaten, her brother, and bore King Tut. And then sometime later, for unknown reasons, she died of a massive facial trauma. Now let's go back to that facial trauma and see how likely or probable it is that KV35YL, younger lady, could have died from a massive facial trauma. Fortunately, some research has been done around this question. Research done by Dr. Plaisir et al. In the Journal of Oral and Maxillofacial Surgery from 2000, July 2000, showed that if you had facial trauma and it involved any more bones than just your mandible, just your jawbone, then you had an 18 to 75 times higher probability of dying from that wound. So if you sustain facial trauma and it only hits your lower jaw, fractures your mandible in other words, you have a much higher probability of surviving. The injury pattern on younger lady involved not just her lower jaw, but several of her facial bones. She would have had a very high probability of dying from that injury. Why are these severe facial fractures so high risk for death? Well, that's multifactorial. One reason they're so dangerous is because of the highly vascular nature of facial bones and structures. Very likely to lose large amounts of blood when you sustain severe facial trauma. The other reason is the direct blow to the face can cause an intracranial injury. So things like a severe concussion, cerebral edema, hemorrhaging inside the cranial cavity. So in layman's terms, the likelihood of your brain being fatally rattled is much higher if you sustain a direct facial bone trauma. Breaking your mandible, just your jawbone, is a catastrophic injury, but it doesn't conduct the force to the brain in the same way that multiple facial bones being traumatized does. So the more facial bones involved, the more likely the wound is to be fatal. That is exactly what seems to have happened to KV35YL, younger lady. If you do a medical literature review from our time, you can guess what the number one cause of severe facial trauma is. That's auto accidents. In fact, it's interesting. These facial fractures have become more common since seatbelt laws were instituted. It used to be that people would die of crushing chest wounds from hitting the steering wheel. But now with the torso restrained by seatbelts and airbags in place, facial fractures become much more common. And since I think we can all agree to rule that out in the case of KV35YL, what are the other causes of severe facial trauma? One of them is sports, high-impact sports. Another is a fall from a height. Another is a blow with a very heavy object, which sometimes happens in workplace accidents, and sometimes happens because that heavy object is a human fist. Looking at the damage to younger lady, I would have to say it doesn't look like somebody punched her. She's missing a large portion of her facial bones and even a portion of her mouth and cheek. Something damaged not only her bones, but her soft tissue severely. So severely that she lost a large portion of her face. So to me it had to be something much more powerful and devastating than a human fist. Looking at the injury pattern of younger lady, and at the potential sources of injury that existed in her world at the time, I think there are 2 or 3 things that are the most likely cause of those injuries. One of those is a horse kick. I looked up 5 case studies. It only took me about 5 minutes to find 5 case studies of young people who had sustained massive facial trauma after being kicked by a horse. Often the injury pattern was much like that on younger lady. These horse kick case studies were devastating and life-threatening injuries because they didn't just have damage to the mandible, not just damage to the facial bones. They had lost soft tissue from the mouth and cheek as well. And in many cases, it took several plastic surgeries just to try to cover that defect. So these injuries described in these case studies reminded me exactly of what you see when you look at Younger Lady. We have to take into account the very real possibility that she was horse-kicked. Along these same lines, it won't surprise anyone to learn I also found a high incidence of facial fractures in people who had been thrown from a horse. 73% of the time, in fact, multiple facial bones are fractured when a rider is thrown or falls from a horse. Now, of course, I couldn't find any evidence in the medical literature about chariot-related facial fractures. That won't surprise you. But I did find something I think is very germane to this discussion. An article written by Heidi Kopjunk, that's her name, Heidi Kopjunk, in the December 2020 issue of Friends of ASOR says this about the use of chariots in New Kingdom Egypt. Quote, in most cases, men are shown on chariots. But there's also evidence for women that significantly increases during Akhenaten's reign. Rare textual and pictorial evidence for women using chariots demonstrate that they employed the same means of transport as men, but representations of Queen Nefertiti are the oldest examples of a woman alone on a chariot. End quote. So that's one more very possible scenario we have to entertain. Younger Lady was apparently royal. She could have had access to chariots. Chariot riding was increasing among women around the time of Akhenaten, around her time. Maybe it's no coincidence that she suffered massive facial injuries that could have come from a catastrophic chariot accident. You might be thinking, well, wouldn't other bones have been broken if she was in such a terrible accident? Well, not necessarily. Imagine the chariot is traveling at speed and it suddenly stops. She's not prepared for the stop and her face slams into the front of the chariot. That would be enough to cause this kind of trauma. So we can't rule out chariot accident in the death of Younger Lady. One final thing that I haven't addressed is foul play with the intent of murdering Younger Lady. This, of course, being the most salacious possibility. Now, it is possible that she was killed. Somebody smashed her mouth with a club or a sword or something heavy and caused her death. And there are conspiracy theories around that. Nefertiti, in a fit of jealousy, one of the priests of Amun who was sick of Akhenaten's new religion. Any number of factors could have come into play. And of course, intentional homicide cannot be ruled out. But we're dealing with probabilities here, and I just don't see it as very likely. And it's not just that murdering members of a royal family was fairly rare in New Kingdom Egypt, because it was. The bigger factor for me is this: why would you kill somebody that way? If the person who supposedly killed Younger Lady was a professional soldier or assassin, they would not have hit her in the mouth to cause her death, without following up with a blow to the cranium or a stab to the heart or something to ensure that she was finished. So it just seems like a very unlikely slipshod, haphazard way to try to kill somebody intentionally. So you can imagine all kinds of scenarios where King Tut's mother might have been executed. There would have only been 3 or 4 people in the entire kingdom who would have had the resources or wherewithal or motivation to have dared to cause the death of King Tut's mother. One of those would have been Akhenaten himself. We know he was a religious zealot. Maybe he saw her backsliding into the old ways of worship, the old gods, and decided to have her killed. It could have been Kia or Nefertiti, 2 of Akhenaten's royal wives. So these are plausible scenarios, but just because a scenario is plausible doesn't mean it's even remotely likely. I consider this very unlikely. We don't have enough information that would lead us to suspect she was murdered. I debated whether to mention this, but one more thing did come to my mind. Remember, King Tut died of a severe femoral fracture, or at least it's very likely that his femur fracture killed him. Well, his mother died of a severe facial fracture. It's possible, at least in my mind it was possible, that they could have been involved in the same accident. Maybe Tutankhamun was taking his mother out for a ride on the chariot, or vice versa. But aside from the endearing sentimentality of this vision, it seems very unlikely. The reason for that is King Tut's mother died long before he was King Tut. There is an official position of King's Mother. No one is listed with that title during the reign of King Tut. Egyptologists believe because of that King Tut's mother died long before he did, before he ever ascended to the throne. So it seems that mother and son did not go out like Butch and Sundance or Thelma and Louise. They died at separate times, and exactly how and why the mother of King Tut died when she did, at such a young age, remains a mystery to this very day. If I had to put money on it, I would say that both mother and son died in a chariot accident. Not at the same time for the reasons I described, but years apart, with younger lady preceding her son in death. This would have been the most dangerous thing that either of them did in all likelihood. But there's also a certain poignancy to it. That's maybe why I like it. The idea that King Tut's mother died. King Tut would have known about that. At some point, he had his own severe chariot accident. He would have lingered for a few days before dying after a femoral fracture. Some of his last thoughts might have been about his mother, about how she died from a chariot accident, that he was going to join her. Who knows? It is possible, though.